Hello, we're now live. This is Christiana Ellis, and with me is my good friend, Meitin.
Yep.
This will be an audio podcast too. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I was to be okay that I am here.
And so we are back for another episode of Watching 100 Movies tonight.
Yay.
Yes, we're getting there. Tonight we're watching number 46, It Happened One Night, and number 45, Shane.
Well, let's be clear for people who have done watch a movie with us. We're not watching them tonight.
Yes.
We have already watched them. We're reviewing them.
Right. Yes. So compared to, contrasting with the other podcast, which is Hey, Want to Watch a Movie, where we watch a movie during the show, this is the one where we talk about the movies that we watched already.
Yes.
And tonight, as previously mentioned, It Happened One Night and Shane. So let's go ahead and just jump right into It Happened One Night, which is a 1934 Frank Capra comedy starring Clark Gable.
Yes, Clark Gable.
Just was on the tip of my tongue. Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. And I had seen this one previously, but you had not.
I had not. No.
So, what did you think? What your first impressions?
I enjoyed it more than I expected to. I don't know. It's weird how I'm trying to think how to explain this. Like, it felt like it didn't start right for me. And usually you want to say like it started slow, but it's almost the opposite. Like it almost started too fast.
Well, I think part of what it is, I think, is that pretty much everybody is unlikable at the beginning of this movie.
Well, and it's just like the exposition is like immediate. It's hey,
well, yeah, it's kind of like
William. Well, I hate that. Well, I'm going to run away. Well, now I'm run away.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, but there's some slight weirdness where her father is like literally keeping her prisoner and slaps her, and then later is like the hero.
Yes.
But of course, he's the hero because
really
he's getting
want her to marry William.
Yeah. He would much rather her marry this unemployed ex-newspaper man with no prospects. That was weird.
Who he met on a bus running away from him while he was trying to take him.
So, the father's behavior is purely plot contrivance at every step, but that's fine because that's not really what we care about.
Right. And that's why I say it started weird, because it starts with that and it comes in so fast and so quick and so like surface level contrivance. Yeah. And it's like I almost like was a little disconcerted. Like, how is this going to be on this list? Like, this just seems shallow almost, and not even silly, just odd.
Mm-hmm.
And then
so just for anyone who hasn't seen it, where we start at the beginning is we have rich girl has eloped and married different rich guy, but older rich guy that her father doesn't like. And her father is like literally keeping her locked up, in a fancy yacht, in order to keep her from going off to be with her new husband until he can have the marriage annulled, which it's not clear how he would be able to do that without her or the groom's permission. I don't think that's how annulment works. But it's also true that he is rich enough to command all sorts of people later. But so in any case, she is so determined that she literally jumps overboard, swims to shore, and is planning to take a night bus from Miami to New York to go be with her husband.
Yes. And it's not nearly as cool as the Harry Potter night bus.
No.
It's cool. It's cooler than you would expect a night bus to be, but not Harry Potter cool.
Well, and technically it ends up being like 3 different buses because they kind of get off and on at various points.
Yes, but all of that exposition that you just gave happens in literally like less than a minute.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's literally the very first scene. There's no setup. It's all just they're having the conversation where they're, you know, like we get about 15 seconds of the deckhands saying, "Should we bring her food?" She says she doesn't want it, but and then we have the argument with her and her dad. And I agree, it starts a little weird. You're almost like, you know, you're kind of impressed with her guts by actually jumping overboard in a fancy dress. Because it seems like, what? That seems impractical. But at the same time, and so then we meet at the bus station, we meet Clark Gable's character. I keep wanting to call him Cary Grant. That's why I stumbled earlier. But we meet Clark Gable's character, who, as we meet him, is on a drunken tirade over the phone to his boss in New York, basically in the process of being fired, but very self-righteous about it. And he's got all of his colleagues around him doing the, you tell him, you're the king. Yeah.
Very Maguire-ish kind of.
Yeah, except that it's not really implied that there's any nobility to his conflict with his editor seems entirely personality based.
Oh yeah, and that's actually true, because in Jerry Maguire, it wasn't like everybody supported him. It was only, that was the whole point. So it's totally not like Jerry Maguire. Like,
well, in the sense that he's feeling very self-righteous about being fired / quitting.
Yes.
And in fact, in terms of the distinction there, he gets fired and his boss hangs up on him, but because he's got all of his guys around him that can't hear over the phone, he hears the dial tone, then he kind of goes, yeah, well, you know what? I wouldn't come back to work for you now, even if you beg me.
Right. And this is just that's a great part of like where it started to click with me what was going to happen in this movie. And to finish up my first impression, or my impression of this movie, I guess, is, yes, it started weird. It felt like, wow, how can this have any kind of plot? And it doesn't, but that becomes okay, because the character personalities are really what drives this movie and what make it so good. And the way that he behaves, and this sort of establishes, once I realized, okay, that established her eccentricity, this established his. Now when they play off of each other, that's going to be the fun part, and that was the fun part. There is no plot. The plot is stupid. I mean, it's very shallow. Yeah. It's silly. It doesn't make any sense. Like, he gets called later in the movie, he's told he was the best newspaper man that the guy ever knew, and the guy pays him money for some bullshit story and then tries to arrest him. Like, it's all nonsense. Like, that part's all nonsense.
Yeah, yeah.
And not even like Marx Brothers clever nonsense. It's just like literally we had to put these things in the movie.
The plot is really just a scaffolding to put all our scenes on, to just kind of approximately hold them in place. But absolutely, the fun is just seeing these two characters bounce off of each other. Right. Each of them, in turn, being either likable, unlikable, sympathetic, mad, and the circling around each other while this obvious tension and chemistry plays throughout.
Right. What I like is that globally it has a normal romantic comedy of people who don't, are mismatched. Mm-hmm. They start off not liking each other and contentious, and maybe one's more friendly than the other. They end up, slowly getting to know each other, and one starts to fall and then backs off. The other starts to fall, backs off. Then they both fall for each other, but then there's a conflict that doesn't allow them to be together, and then there's a resolution where they do end up together. Pretty standard. But like you said, the way they circle around each other is not standard. It doesn't, the ebbs and flows aren't like a normal romantic comedy. Like, there are times when they're both way more into it than they should be for a standard plot, or one's way more into the other and one really hates the other more than a standard plot. Like, it just kind of plays differently. It's fun. Right.
Yeah. Cause they have it's not the hate, sudden revelation. Oh my gosh, that hate was actually love all along. Instead, it's really just like they'll be getting along, they'll be having fun, but then they have an argument, and then they're mad at each other for a while, but then he'll do something nice, and then she appreciates it, and she says something nice, and then she demonstrates previously unknown skills, and he's impressed. But then they have another fight, and the conflict towards the end that, you know, provides the tension for the climax, I thought it was actually pretty well crafted, because essentially they, you know, it is fundamental to their characters that they're still not great at communicating with each other, even though she is essentially now completely professed her love and he just shut her down. But we can see in his eyes that he's shutting her down because he thinks we couldn't really do that. Like, somehow that wouldn't work. Like, I'm not really able to be what she wants me to be. Luna, come on. Sorry. And so we can see that she's distraught because he essentially just says no. But then she goes to sleep and he changes his mind and decides to go off and do this incredibly romantic gesture, fails to get back before she wakes up and gets kicked out of the hotel room. So she thinks he just dumped her. And then when he finally gets back, he sees her leaving with her husband and assumes, oh, she's dumped me and gone back to him. And so they're both pissed at each other, thinking that the other has betrayed. They've been betrayed each other. And yet we know that it was dumb, but good intentions on both sides.
Yes. And and so it does work really well. And another thing I had to keep reminding myself is that this movie was made in 1934. So, you know, I don't want to say it set the stage for romantic comedies of this nature where they hate each other, but it certainly gave some groundwork to the ones that are more clever. And I know that it was not new to this genre in 1934. I mean, what's 10 Things I Hate About You based on? Is it the Taming
that's the Taming of the Shrew.
Yeah, Taming of the Shrew. So the Taming of the Shrew has some elements of that. I know it's not exactly, but there is.
Well, and it's also fair to ask whether that one is technically more based on Taming of the Shrew or more based on Kiss Me Kate, which was itself an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew. But yeah. But anyway, that starts getting meta and recursive.
The existence of people not getting along and then falling in love.
Yeah. I mean, certainly
that's been around for a very long time. This didn't invent it, but this definitely modernized it in a way that, you know, you got to say it's had some influence on things like, there was one I kept always thinking of to compare it to. It's the one where she's writing this, like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. That reminded me a lot of this, because that has a lot of the same, like, they go into it with different mentalities and then their mentalities change and they're never quite on the same page. You know, that felt like this had influence on that, even though it's not the same story, but it was very much, you know, they can never quite get it right until the very end. Yeah.
Well, and of course, the other movie that we've watched for this podcast, even though technically it wasn't on the list, it was my write-in, but it has very similar energy to His Girl Friday.
It has very similar energy, yes. Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, the plot on that one is different because they're actually previously in a romantic relationship that then they divorced, and then that's a whole other thing. That one, of course, is a lot more plot-based around that. Meaning there's more plot in that one as opposed to this one where it's essentially just things happen while they're on their way to New York.
Right, but I do agree with you. The energy of the way that the characters bounce off of each other and their dialogue, and like the fun of how this stuff all happens. And
well, it's what I think sort of came to be thought of as the screwball comedy.
Yes.
And at least on the IMDb trivia page, there's one of the trivia things that says, it is often credited as the very first screwball comedy, but with no link or attribution or anything. So I don't know who it is that's supposed to have said that, but certainly in 1934, there were not a lot of them before that.
But that has to be part of the reason, you know, when we start getting into this part of the list, there tends to be like a thing that has put the movie, that has got people to vote to put this movie at this high. Because all of these movies now are going to be good. They're all going to have equal relevance at some point to everything else on this list. So there's going to be a thing. And I think we know what the thing is going to be in Shane. The end, obviously.
Yeah.
But this one is it established screwball comedies. That's why it's on there, is because it is credited generically with doing that. You know, like I said, not like there's no true link to it, but that's what people. But there are many people who believe that. The same as, like I said, I was watching it not actually having had read that on IMDb, because I went into this a little bit cold, which made the open that much more difficult to take in at first. But I felt that way. Like, so whether or not it truly is the first screwball comedy, or that it defined how this type of romantic comedy where there's like an antagonism at the beginning and then it grows into a love, whether or not it truly was the first, it does it all very well. And it did it very early in the century, very early in movie making. You know,
it's our first Frank Capra movie on the list.
Yes.
We have a few more of those to come further up the list. But it also has a lot of just Hollywood lore to it. First of all, it was the very first movie to ever sweep the main categories in the Oscars, winning Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, and Best Script.
That, I think, is a testament to, like what I said earlier, when you have to take a step back and remember this movie was made in 1934. Because it is made with a skill that is beyond what a 1934 movie would look like.
Right, and there's lots of little things that we can catch now. Like one thing that jumped out at me was during the scene, the undressing scene, which is great in other ways, but the reason I bring it up right now is there's kind of a weird jump cut where when she finally breaks and runs, we see her start to do that, and then we cut to a different angle where she hasn't done it yet and then does it. And so it's sort of just an awkward edit that I think movies today would probably smooth that out. But of course, movies today are much more able to have fancy, sophisticated editing suites to do just about anything they want. Whereas they were literally working with film and scissors and tape. Back in the day.
Well, that's why it's impressive. I mean, the writing in this movie is so, and of course the acting and the delivery of it, because you can see, like, this movie moves. You know, I joked about at the beginning, like it almost starts too fast, but it needs to when you really settle in, because you never settle in. Like, the movie is just fast. Well,
plus we need to get to the main thing. You know, we need to get to her and him on the bus. The rest of it, everything before that, is really only setup, and we don't want to waste time with that if we can avoid it.
But even their interactions are fast, and the way they think is fast, and that's part of what makes the dialogue funny and clever, is that because it doesn't have to worry about any true plot ramifications, it can be it's just quick-witted and fast, and like, she gets on the bus, doesn't want to sit by him, can't fall asleep, or the guy falls asleep on her, so she hops up, he pretends to be asleep, and then she falls asleep, and like he puts his coat on her, and then like it just keeps happening, and then there's the one where I was really like, man, this is just such tight writing, because it just makes it feel like this is actually how these people act, is when the guy, Smith or whatever, the guy who kept introducing himself by his last name, discovers that...
Shapley,
discovers that there's a reward, and he tries to approach him, and instead of getting the reward, he thinks he's going to be clever and have him just pay him cash to be quiet.
Yeah.
And Clark Gable's character just takes it and he runs it in a way that you never would ever think of. When he pretends that like he's actually kidnapped her, and now this guy's in on it, and he's part of this big mafia conspiracy, and of course he can get money if he can keep his mouth shut and
like, oh man, it's so good to have a partner on this. So where's your gun? Where's your rod?
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? What, you don't even have a gun? Oh, that's okay. I got machine guns in my suitcase. You can have one of those.
Right.
What?
And just, like, it's moving. He's speaking so fast and he's thinking so fast that, like, it's not real. Like, that would never really happen. And that guy would never really approach him that way. He would never really fall for that. But the fact that, like, it happens so quickly, like, you're loving it and you're like, yes, he totally convinced him of something that he should not have been able to convince him.
But at the same time, it was practical in the sense that even he, like, the next time we see the two, we see our hero and heroine, they have left the bus too. And she's like, well, I don't see why we had to leave the bus. So you've made him leave the bus. And he's like, well, see, the thing is, I scared him enough to get off the bus and be quiet now. But as soon as he gets to a phone, he's still going to call. It's like
yeah, as soon as he's safe. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things that's really notable and important about Clark Gable's performance in this specifically is that it was the inspiration for something of extreme cultural significance. And I don't know if you didn't read the trivia, you might not know this, but can you guess what character Clark Gable's performance in this movie inspired?
You give me some hint of either a genre or a time frame, something to...
Eating the carrots.
Oh, Bugs Bunny.
Yeah. It was exactly the inspiration for Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny's creator even said so. Because Bugs Bunny first started showing up in cartoons in the late 30s, and his first sort of fully formed cartoon was in 1940. And you watch that scene where he's talking a mile a minute and eating the carrots at the same time. I mean, it's exactly Bugs Bunny. It's just like...
I kind of almost want to go. I kind of want to back and watch that scene because that's awesome.
Well, I bet people could find that scene on YouTube, if for no other reason than because of this very issue. But that's I think a really cool element to it too. And it's just I think they're both really funny and they both have great chemistry, not just in the humorous scenes, but in like some of the more serious stuff too, because I mentioned before that undressing scene, because that scene, for those who haven't seen the movie, this is the first time they're having to stay the night in a hotel room together, where they have told the owners that they're married, but of course they're really at this point almost complete strangers. And he has made it clear, I'm willing to essentially pay for this hotel room so you don't have to stand out in the rain, and it's so that I want you to give me an exclusive story about what you're doing.
Yep.
And it's basically a very mercenary sort of thing that her first instinct would be to reject on the face of it, except the alternative is actually to go stand out in the rain because she has no money. And she can't afford to wire her father because that's, of course, the whole thing that she's doing is running away. And it's not made explicit why she wouldn't wire her husband, but the reason for that is that we know is that he's being watched and can't, the father is having the husband watched, and so therefore wouldn't be able to communicate that way. But in any case, it's also interesting that this movie was one of the very first movies to really follow the so-called Hays Code of movies, which was instituted in the mid 30s, to basically say no nudity in movies, no sexy stuff in movies, no like all of that sort of thing, the moral code that lasted for a while in movies. And so some of the scenes in this were changed because of that in order to make them a bit more chaste. And yet, interestingly enough, I think a bit like with Jaws, how it's improved by them not being able to show the shark for so long.
Yep.
Forcing them to stay apart so dramatically in the whole Walls of Jericho.
The Walls of Jericho contrivance was amazing.
So great, right? Especially how they kept calling back to it, and then the final shot and everything.
Yeah, you almost said the climax.
Yeah.
but how great is that? Is the thing they never. That's all they had to show was the rug falling to the ground after he had sent the telegram. Is that annulment taken care of? The walls of Jericho are crumbling.
Yeah, and then he gets a little toy trumpet.
Yeah, exactly. He gets a little toy trumpet, and then you see the walls falling, and you know exactly what is happening. Like, that just basically says they're now having sex. Like, it screams it to everyone in the audience.
Yeah.
There's nothing visual there that indicates that. But the way the movie's constructed leaves you with that impression. Yeah. It's amazing. It's very, very clever.
Well, and that scene, even though what happens is we see him get partly undressed, and then she gets a little bit undressed herself later in like on the other side of the blanket, but just like that scene, that's kind of a sexy scene, even though like the rule is he can't show anything, except it's still all there, and it's almost more exciting because of that restriction on it.
Yeah.
One other bit of trivia that's interesting is that Clark Gable was not wearing an undershirt under his shirt when he was undressing. So when he's taking off his suspenders and the jacket and undoing the shirt, he's not wearing an undershirt. And that was not the style at the time. People typically did wear undershirts. And they had him not wearing it specifically because he's doing this whole patter as he undresses, and it was just complicating things. And so they had him just not wearing the undershirt. But then this movie was so popular that sales of undershirts actually went down. And there was talk of whether the underwear company was going to like sue the movie studio or something. And so that's some of that might be apocryphal, but certainly
that's part of what makes a good movie is to have that lore associated with it. You know.
Well, and this movie has a lot of that too, because first of all, Frank Capra already had like a whole bunch of actors and actresses turn him down to make this movie in the first place. He only ended up getting Claudette Colbert to agree to it on the promise that they would film the whole movie in 4 weeks so that it would be done by the time she was going on vacation. And by all accounts, she hated every minute of the production. When she finished her last day, she literally said, "I just finished making the worst picture I've ever made." And then, even when it was nominated for all these awards, she didn't even go to the ceremony at first. And she was planning to go on another trip. And when they announced that she won, this is the weirdness of Hollywood back then, they literally went and got her to have her come to the ceremony just to get the award. So she like came on in her like traveling gear to get her Academy Award.
It's unreal.
Yeah, and it's like we've talked about, or I guess we haven't really talked about Casablanca yet, but it's one of the examples that's often given about how, the studios made so many movies. They would make like 9 or 10 a year. They made them just so rapid fire, and Casablanca wasn't really supposed to be anything special. It wasn't a big epic. It was just kind of another one, and yet somehow everything just came together and clicked. And I think this is kind of another example of a movie where like nobody seemed to think it was going especially well during production.
Yeah.
And yet the finished product is enormously entertaining to watch. I had seen it once before, but it was a pleasure to revisit. I hadn't remembered all the details. I mostly just remembered a couple of scenes in particular, the hitchhiking scene, for one, just because that's a perfect example of a scene that feels almost like it's cliche, but it's kind of it's another, like with Bugs Bunny, it like inspired so many cartoons to do riffs on that scene that we sort of associate it more with the cartoons that were riffing on it later. And yet, at the same time, I can't help but think that it must have been riffing on something else in the ether, even at the time. It just feels too much constructed like a joke. You know what I mean? The idea of her going out to show her leg, it feels a bit more like a joke than something her character would have organically thought of. Not that I'm complaining, but it's just it is structured like a gag because he first sets up that he's an expert in hitchhiking and he's got his whole technique down. You got the different kinds of thumbs. You got the simple, firm, and then you got the the funny one, like you got a news story about a farmer's daughter, or you got the serious one, and then he's always doing all this stuff, but then he is having no luck.
Third one's the sweep.
Yeah, the sweep, yeah. But then he starts having no luck, and more to the point, once several cars start coming by in rapid succession, and he's having no luck, he gets all flustered and he starts doing all the stuff that he said not to do. That only amateurs would ever do that stuff. And then finally, like the last one, we actually see him. He's making faces at him.
Yeah.
But then, of course, she just like, oh well, mind if I try? And then she comes out, shows her leg, and the very first car just screeches to a halt, emergency brake and everything, skidding tire marks on the road.
Which, of course, it turns out later in the plot that that guy specifically picks up hitchhikers to steal their stuff.
Yeah, and what a weird guy too. Just this guy he's singing at the top of his voice as they're driving along. Young people are never hungry, or whatever that song was.
Yes.
Oh man, and then I just forgot what I was going to say there. But there's just so much great stuff that's happening in here, and little things that are interesting to think about, just in the sense that it was made, let me think, 80 years ago and a bit.
81, yeah.
And so we think about they're taking this night bus from Miami to New York, but there's not even interstates then.
It's true.
Yeah, so they're Luna, please stop. So they're taking all of these, like what we would think of as the back roads or the surface roads. So the bus will get stuck in mud. They have to stop at a hotel for one night because the bridge is washed out, and it's like there's not these interstates that are just cruising along at 75 miles an hour. So you don't have to, when I mute to yell at my dog, you guys don't have to, you can keep talking.
No interstates.
Yeah. And just thinking about the time period that this was all in terms of just the culture, because there was elements of, we talk about how, I was saying earlier, how would they get it annulled, the marriage annulled, if both the bride and groom don't want to? At the same time, there was what we also see of her father later is that he can basically just march into cities where he doesn't live and then just demand that the entire police force be mobilized to look for his runaway daughter.
Yes.
And they just jump to it. And that's sort of thing. And, and so the movie is also a little bit weird in how it completely reverses direction on what we're supposed to think about her father and what he's like, and the idea of, how did he raise her, and what does having money do to a person? Because certainly one of the themes all along is that she's kind of spoiled, but then she also makes a pretty solid case for, sure, I had things, but I wasn't allowed to do anything the way I wanted. I'm always told, go here, do that. I don't have freedom to do what I want. And in fact, what we discover is the only reason she got married to this other guy is he was literally the first guy she ever got to have a conversation with when she didn't have permission to.
Right.
And so that was almost entirely what she liked about him, is that he was not her dad.
Right.
And so it's we don't really get much of a sense of King Wesley is this guy's name. he's not a king. I guess that's just his name, which is a little weird too. You know, I guess we don't hear a lot of people named King anymore.
I didn't even realize that. I thought he was a king.
Oh no, I think he's just another rich guy. The kind of guy who decides to show up to his wedding in an autogyro. It also is interesting to just think about the press at the time, because we see all of these newspapers where like literally front page giant headline is about, hey, this rich girl ran away. Where is she now? And then later, oh, love triumphs because her dad decided to let her get married after all. But at the same time, all of this is not meant to be very serious. It's really all just about creating the circumstances in which our characters can swim around.
Yep.
So let me think. We've kind of covered a lot of the various little trivia bits that I had mentioned. So, I mean, again, other than just kind of, I feel like we kind of rolled through it.
But depth to the movie. I mean, let's not. It doesn't try to have it, so we're not disrespecting it by not giving it more depth than it deserves. I mean, it's a screwball comedy. It's incredibly well done. Mm-hmm. It's so much fun to watch. But that's it. Like, we're not doing it any respect by not having a longer conversation. There's no deeper meaning.
Well, I think I just get paranoid, when we have gaps between episodes of this where it's like, oh, what if we've lost our rhythm or something? We're going to be too short. But I guess that's probably not a real problem. It's all in my head.
No, there's no problem. We've discussed everything there is to discuss about the movie. It deserves to be on the list. It's very, very good. It's an aspect of everything working correctly, even if they didn't intend it to be this good. And it laid the groundwork for a lot of other great stuff. That's pretty much what happened. That's about it.
Well, all right then. So I guess that means it's time to go ahead and move on to number 45 on the list. Shane, the 1953 Western starring Alan Ladd and Jean Arthur.
Yep.
Let's see. Director George Stevens, who I guess off the top of my head, I wasn't thinking of it. I didn't look up to see what else he had done. Looks like he did a fair number of movies at the time, but like The Giant, Place in the Sun, Diary of Anne Frank. So he did a bunch of stuff. But so neither of us had seen this movie going in, although I think probably both of us knew various things about it that had kind of percolated through just pop culture awareness. Right. And one of those things, of course, being the discussion about the ending, which I don't know if we want to, maybe don't have to jump right into it. At least anyone who hasn't seen it, the premise is a fairly standard one for Westerns in the sense that we got gunfighter who's trying to put it behind him, shows up where there's a conflict between good-hearted homesteaders and mean old ranchers, and he has to take up the 6 guns one more time to protect the virtuous. And so it's
essentially Unforgiven.
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially 80% of Westerns, which I don't say to diminish it. You know what I mean? It's just, it is heavy with the tropes that define the Western genre as much as the setting. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the plot to it. But of course, I think was most aware of the ending of this movie because of a discussion had between Samuel L. Jackson and Kevin Spacey in the movie The Negotiators, which is a relatively forgettable movie, except that I remembered the fact that they argue about whether or not Shane was in fact alive at the end. I don't know that we need to jump right to there. Maybe we can talk to more general impressions first.
Reason, like I said, we're getting to the point there's this little piece in this list where there's going to be like a thing or a reason that put a movie on it because they're all very good quality. Eventually, we're going to get to a point where, like, the top 10, there's just so much good quality that it blows other things away. But this kind of piece here, this 40 to, and I'm speaking generally, there's going to be a lot of movies that are very good that just have like that one thing that clicks them over. And that's the thing with Shane, is that it prompted this discussion that still exists today of was Shane dead at the end of the movie? And, I have my opinion, which is a little different than most people would think, but it's also my opinion is why I believe that ending it this way is important and why it makes this movie good. So we won't go into that yet, like the whole discussion of it, but that is why the movie is this.
Yeah, we'll come back around to that to talk about it in more detail. But what I'll say in terms of my general impressions, though, is I feel like I can appreciate it on an intellectual level. It does a lot of things well that I can admire, but for whatever reason, it was not clicking for me emotionally. I was having a hard time with this movie. I was checking my watch even as he's riding in for the final climax. I respect the movie. I was a little surprised to feel that way because I felt like I was open to it at the beginning, but for whatever reasons that I can't quite put my finger on, I was not able to fully engage with the characters. And so I really am left kind of saying, I respect it, but I was a little bit bored watching it.
Interesting. I mean, it's hard for me to speak because I did watch it in two pieces. And this is going to sound damning, but it's not meant to be. The first time that I watched it, I did fall asleep. But not because the movie bored me, but because I started watching it and then I got interrupted by some work phone calls, and then I tried to keep watching it, but it was too late at that point that I just eventually got tired and went to sleep. And so the next night I started the movie fresh again from where I was and watched the last, 45 minutes of it. So I almost got to watch all of essentially the build up, fall asleep, start the next night with here. I already understood all the build up and just watch the final climax. So it's hard for me to say whether or not I would have been checking my watch or bored. And like I said, I don't want to damn it with the fact that I fell asleep. It was late, but I just watched it in a different way, Yeah,
I think part of what it was for me, on the one hand, it's a little bit unfair for me to judge it against other things rather than on its own merits, or in putting it in the right context. But at the same time, I think I'm entitled to my own emotional response, right? That I think I just prefer the more modern Westerns that are dark, a little grittier, more violent, more realistic. I mean, now on the one hand, when we put this movie in the historical context, it actually is that a lot more than other contemporary Westerns of its time, that were a lot less complex than this one is. And so this one is taking some big steps in the direction of the kind of Westerns I like more. And yet I felt like it was just not far enough along for me yet. And part of what's happening there is that I've been rewatching Deadwood.
Yeah.
And so compared to that, it just feels so cardboard and make-believe. And so, I think part of what it is again, this is maybe just the old-fashioned Western elements that it still embodies to a large extent, but nobody acts like that, and nobody ever did act like that. It's practically a fairy tale. We might as well be watching a story about witches and trolls and stuff, because people don't act like they do in these old-fashioned Westerns. And I don't think they ever did. I think it is entirely a Hollywood invention.
Yes.
And there's just a number of sequences in the movie where I was just pissed off at the characters for behaving so irrationally. And it bugged me. And so I think that was part of what it was. And so when I think about it again intellectually, I can say, well, this movie was making progress towards the Western genre being more like what I like it to be compared to the more simple ones from before. And yet I still feel like watching it, it's not far enough along yet for me to enjoy it as much as I would have liked.
Right.
I didn't hate it. I just was not engaged.
Right. And I know you sort of dismissed my comparison to Unforgiven and said it's like 80% of all Westerns.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I don't, yeah.
But, yeah, I think, and the reason why I brought that comparison up is very much for the same reason that you just articulated. Because part of what makes Unforgiven so good for me is it is so real. It's like, what does it feel like to be past your prime, to be trying to get rid of this thing that is what defined you? And, there's so much realness and grittiness to Unforgiven, even though it really tells almost an identical story. Like,
yeah,
he's a great gunfighter, doesn't want to be killing people anymore. He's done with it. He gets himself involved with some people who need his help and aren't necessarily as skilled as he is. And he sort of, he appreciates their help and tries to let them take the lead on it, but doesn't want to step in and take over as the guy. That's very happens almost identical in Unforgiven. Happens here. He's got Stark or whatever his name is.
It's like Starrett. It's a weird name.
Yeah, it is a weird name. That's why I just call him Stark.
Yeah, Starrett. So it's Starrett. But I agree with you. Watching the movie, I wasn't sure either because it sounded like different things depending on who was saying it.
Right. And then it comes to this climactic gunfight. There's a hired evil gun. And so it's so much like it, but Unforgiven is so much more real and gritty, and it feels like that's what it would have felt like to be in that position. This doesn't feel like that. It's like Shane puts on his little frilly thing and takes his white guns to go kill these. I mean, it's just kind of silly. You're right. There are some things though that I really did like about it. The cinematography is amazing. For that time, obviously, Western sceneries have been much more well shot.
Well, I think one of the things, and I listened to the commentary as well. I think partly because I was looking for more reason to respect the movie because my first reaction had been a little bit underwhelmed. And I don't mean to say that dismissively, but it's one of the things that they talk about in that is how many Westerns of the time were all done on sets and backlots.
Yeah.
Where they would have just the facade of the Western town that looks just like every other friggin' Western town that's in anything.
Right.
But this one looks very different because they really did go out in the middle of nowhere. And, when they go to town, what town is 6 buildings that are approximately close to each other in this gigantic plain with huge mountains in the background.
Right.
It looks different. It's interesting in that regard.
It is. And so when you're talking about having to look for a little bit more respect for the movie, there are some things in the movie that make it move a little bit more slowly and make it linger because they're lingering on the shots. They're showing how long it takes him to ride up the hill, down the hill, into town with the big backdrop. Those are things that maybe we take a little bit for granted because it's not as cool now. But there are some artifices put into this film that make it take longer than it needed to for particularly that reason.
Yeah.
And it's not, now I don't want to totally forgive it because, for example, we're going to get to some other movies that do some amazing cinematography, but play it into the movie a lot better.
Yeah.
When we get to Lawrence of Arabia, I mean, that's some phenomenal cinematography. That's some phenomenal like settings that we're not used to. But they managed to use their lingering shots to tell part of the story.
Yeah.
How vast this desert is and stuff like that. Whereas this, it just felt like, oh, we've got a great shot. Let's just kind of sit here for a minute and not go away from it and let them continue to talk about whatever. And, it slowed the movie down. So and I know that wasn't your number one criticism, but that definitely helps paint your feeling, whether you identified that or not. Is there some very slow moving parts?
Well, yeah, and I think I maybe would have been able to get past the more slow moving parts more easily if I was more engaged otherwise. But again, like when I'm talking about looking at my watch, it's because things are taking a long time to happen.
Yeah.
And one of the things
it's almost like they're together. Like,
yeah.
Without the slow moving, you would have forgiven the slow moving parts if the other stuff engaged you, but maybe you would have been more engaged in the other stuff if there weren't all these slow moving parts and it just kind of got into it, And I understand you have like the physical actions that they take problems, but you know what I mean.
Well, so one of the things that I did discover rewatching it though, in with the commentary, is a bit more recognition that some of the stuff that I had kind of just dismissed as 1952 Western movie weirdness is a little bit more deliberate. And again, this is some of the aspects of the way that this movie was evolving the Westerns of the time. And that being just there being some ambiguity and complexity in Shane's actions. Because on the one hand, superficially, the movie is more or less told from the perspective of this little kid. We're seeing everything sort of through his eyes, which, just as a brief side note, that kid was weird looking and it distracted me every time he was on screen.
Shane.
It's like his eyes were like just a little bit cross-eyed. Like, I don't want to be like judgmental about someone who's who looks like that. But at the same time, like they cast this kid, right? Like they picked this kid.
And there were tons of close-ups of him.
Yeah, and so anyway, that's a real side note because it's totally superficial and ultimately not critical to the film. But I did notice every time he was on screen, it just like, why does he look like that? Which I know it's like a weird complaint, but anyway. But there are elements of the way Shane acts that tell a little bit of a subtext story that probably that the kid is not aware of at all. And we have to watch it with our grown-up eyes to see that. For example, it seems really obvious to me on the second viewing that I didn't fully get the first time through that Shane absolutely picks the fight with those guys at the bar. He goes in the first time where he's at the store, he's buying his fancy new clothes, and then he sees that there's a saloon. And there's a moment where it lingers like, am I going to go in there? If I go in there, they're probably going to harass me. And then he does, and he lets them harass him and harass him and harass him. And then he walks away without doing anything. And then later, when everyone is like, first of all, again, it was one of the things that bugged me that like the kid's like, what? Shane wouldn't do that. Let them get away with that. He wouldn't do that. And I'm thinking, first of all, kid, you just met this guy.
Yeah, you have no idea.
You don't know what he's like. Anyway, and also just this implication that somehow deciding to get in a fist fight with someone because they insult you is the way you ought to be. That bugged me, that whole attitude. But, at the same time, I think that's very in keeping with the Western themes at the time, right? But when he goes back the second time, still without his guns, and after what happened the first time he went there, and then he just marches right up back to the bar, like the kid is going to return the bottle, and Shane says, here, give it to me.
Oh, yeah.
And so he goes in there. He's totally going in there to pick a fight.
Yes, and I'm not trying to say like, oh, how would you have not seen that on the first viewing? I happened to pick that up pretty quickly. Like for me, like I got it.
I guess what I mean, the complexity, not that I didn't realize that was what was happening, but as much as thinking more about his motivations, I think is more what the revelation was, as opposed to it being, oh, so he's going to go pick a fight now because that's what the script says. But thinking about, who is Shane? Who is this guy? Why does he do the things that he does? And recognizing that when we look at the movie in total, the ending aside, it seems pretty likely that as much as he's protesting that he's trying to put this gunfighter stuff behind him, it seems fairly likely that he kind of does this with every little town he goes through. Is that he finds some reason to insert himself and pick a fight with guys that he sees as beneath him, and then he kills them. And then he moves on because he has to, because he killed people now.
Right. That's a complexity I hadn't thought of. I think, again, because I probably was shaded by the fact that I keep comparing this to Unforgiven. For whatever reason, it just felt like that movie.
Yeah.
But in that movie, it's very clear which parts of his motivations are noble and which parts are just because that's who he is. Mm-hmm. And this doesn't clarify that as much. And,
Yeah, all of this is subtext. Like, none of that is made explicit in the movie. And, like,
it's not necessarily made explicit in Unforgiven, except that it's the subtext is more well crafted, that you can lift it better.
It's less buried.
Yeah, less
buried. Because Shane has this whole more superficial level where you could read everything is just straight ahead from the kid's perspective stuff. You know what I mean? And you can watch the whole movie from that perspective and not even see that there's that other layer there.
Right.
And I really just didn't even fully register that layer, that it was deliberate, until that second viewing, as much as it just seemed like some weirdness. Like, why is Shane doing that? That's weird. But realizing that there's a bit more method to the madness on the second viewing, which again is an aspect of something that I can respect and admire, at the same time that it didn't really work for me emotionally.
Well, yeah, and one of the interesting things that they play here, and again, like I wish I could come up with another movie that had this plot to compare it to, but again, comparing to Unforgiven, like Alan Ladd he's a pretty boy. Mm-hmm. He's got the perfect blonde hair, blue eyes, like he dresses nice. And Clint Eastwood is worn down and grizzled at the end of that movie. Like, he is just run down. So it's easier to understand that, like, he's had this whole life of, like, trouble and he's trying to stay out of it. Like, he wears that on his face, where Shane doesn't wear any trouble on his face. He's kind of a smart-ass looking guy, and even that fight he picks is kind of a smart-ass way to pick a fight. Like, oh, I let him fuck with me a little bit. Now I'm going to march back in there, and I'm going to pull this clever little trick where I'm going to order 2 whiskeys, throw them both on him, and then
punch him.
Yeah, and then punch him, and
sucker punch him while he's reeling from getting whiskey thrown in his face.
Yeah, like, he's not exactly a great guy, but yet he has this, like, smug look to him that makes it very. And at first it was kind of off-putting, but I kind of respect the movie for putting him, like, making him look like, this poster boy of, like, a Western.
Yeah.
By his looks, but by his behavior or not. I mean, in order to go kill those guys, he has to beat the living shit out of his new best friend.
Including concussing him with his gun.
And it drives the point home, which I thought was, it's standard storytelling trope, but a lot of people forget it. The fact that he concusses him and, like, throws him against the trunk that they pulled out of the ground together, and that's what started the foundation of their friendship, and this is him being his friend because he's saving his life, but he's also beating the shit out of him.
Well, see, that was part of what was turning me off in the whole final act, is just some of the some of the morality of the film, and this is true whether we're looking at the superficial level or the one layer deeper level, is some of the morality and the philosophy of the way they live their lives is total bullshit. You know, first of all, there's this whole element that's actually nicely played, this idea that there's this romantic tension that's never acted on between Shane and Marion, the ranger wife. Yeah, so that's a well done aspect of the movie. But then as we're getting up to this last bit where we've got the husband of this rancher family wanting to saying is like, it's gone too far, I've got to go and try to kill this guy. Except it seems obvious to everyone, more or less including him, that he's just going to get himself killed. And there's this whole argument where his wife is saying, how about you not? Let's just leave. That would be better. We would rather have you alive and come with us and go set up a new place somewhere else where we don't have to fight this guy. Please don't go get yourself killed. And then he's like, come on, you love this place as much as I do, more. And she's like, not anymore. Not if it's going to get you killed. And he's like, even if that were true, I just don't think I could live with myself knowing that I ran. And I'm thinking, what? She's telling you how she feels right now. You're putting it on her that you have to go do this when she is explicitly yelling at you not to.
Yeah, and see, I took all of this a little bit of a different way. Well, I totally understand what you're saying. Mm-hmm. I took this as that subplot of Shane and his wife and the attraction was a bigger deal than they kind of let on. And that's what this was about.
Well,
this was about him trying to win her back or lose her forever. Like, I'm going to go and either I'm going to get killed and then Shane's going to take my place, which he explicitly says.
Yeah.
I'm going to win this fight and I'm going to win our land and then I'm going to be the man and you're going to stay with me and Shane's going to be out of the picture. And that's why him and Shane have this heated fight about who's going to go do this.
You know, that's interesting, and it maybe even makes more sense than the way I took that bit, which was almost a little bit more pessimistic on the part of Elder Joe Starrett, or whatever his freaking name is. I read it almost more of he was kind of conceding to Shane already in a way. And like expecting, like, well, maybe I'll actually get this guy. But I'm almost like he was expecting to go off and get killed. And that was like for the best, because then Shane would take over and he was better anyway.
Yeah, no, I that's not how I took it as like he had decided he only had two choices, which was to win this and win his position back, alpha male style.
Yeah.
Concede it or lose and then let Shane take it over. And Shane wasn't going to let that happen. And that's why, but Joe felt like he needed to be the one who determined it, which is why they got into the fight. But then that's the whole point, is that Shane doesn't want to stay with her. Like, he wants her to be in what's the position that's best for her, which is with Joe, with him killing the bad guys and then leaving.
Yeah.
And that's sort of Shane's, how his piece moves on.
Right.
So that's how I felt it all played together. And so I forgive it a lot more. Yes.
See, for me, it played as competing martyr complexes, because even the way you just described it, that's certainly what Shane is doing, is this element of, I'm going to take this burden on so that you guys can stay and be happy. Whereas you're thinking that Joe was more of a trying to actually get it done so that he can feel good and be in charge again. And I guess that makes sense. It almost makes more sense than the way I was thinking about it. But it almost felt to me like when Joe has that conversation and he talks to Marion about this, where he kind of says more or less, it'll be okay even if I'm killed because Shane will take care of things, like take care of you. Like, that bit to me felt almost more like that's what he expects to happen. Not a, well, in case I don't do it, I at least know that. It felt almost more like, no, I think this is what will happen. But I see what you're saying too, and I think it's interestingly complex.
Right, and see, I almost felt like that was him saying, like, his way of saying it to her in a way that wasn't so aggressive, and just being like, look, this is, I have to go do this. This is a thing I have to do. And if I win, then I've won our place back and the place that you love. If I don't, then I am conceding this to Shane, which it's clear that there's a thing there. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like, ball don't lie. If I die, then it's for Shane, Yeah. That's how I read it. And it's actually interesting that we're having this discussion, because I didn't even think of it the way that you did, which adds another layer to this whole climax of this movie, is that's one of the things this movie does well, is leave a lot of this stuff up for discussion.
Yeah. And I agree, and I can respect that aspect, but I think part of where I was is rejecting the notion of having to choose between Joe or Shane and saying, why don't we just listen to Marion, who is insisting that neither of them go to do this and that they actually just leave? Because they're both pretending that they're doing it for her when she is the one yelling at them that that's not what she wants them to do.
You and your female protagonist. Weird.
But, so like, I think that bugged me a little bit. The pretense of doing it for her when she is explicitly telling them in a very emotional way that that's not what she wants.
And that's fair, and that's. I don't want this to sound like terrible, but that's just part of. Again, it's what you watching movies from two different perspectives. Mm-hmm. Like,
oh yeah, no, and I.
You're going to notice those things more than I'm going to notice those things, and it doesn't make me chauvinistic or. Oh
no, I don't mean to imply that. No,
that's just, and I don't think you are. I'm just saying that's a realistic way. Is that you watch a movie like this that is very. It was made in the 50s. It's a Western. Mm-hmm. It is made from a very male point of view. So when I watch it, I see it in a different way. Even though that I'm a 2015 male, like I don't watch it the same as 1950s, but I still see that vein. It's just that's just reality. Mm-hmm. You see, having now, been exposed to lots of great content that has strong female protagonists, you see how that can work its way in here. And while I recognize that once it's happened, I'm not going to see it on the back end the way that you do. That's just reality.
Well, yeah, and I think that's part of just what frustrated me was not so much. This was, I think, where the movie was just in kind of an awkward adolescence for Westerns, and that maybe is where I was having trouble, is that it was introducing these areas of ambiguity and complexity, but in some respects not fully committing to them, is what it felt like to me. And that was one example. Also, just the theme throughout of the idea that, you're yella if you don't stand up for yourself by picking a fight with someone who's just said mean things to you. Yeah. Because, and again, that's, I guess, part of this aspect that, I don't know, I weirdly simultaneously wanted the movie to either be more like the old-fashioned Westerns or more like the modern ones, and this weird middle ground is what irked me.
Right, because it sort of birthed the modern Western. It was shot on location. Let's give it its pluses.
Oh yeah, no, it has many pluses. I want to keep emphasizing that I respect the movie. I think it's well made. I understand why people like it, why it's important.
To talk, compare it to the one we just watched, where character and plot depth weren't not necessarily the strengths of it. It was more of character interaction. Mm-hmm. Character depth on this is much bigger deal. And it doesn't always ring as true as a phenomenal movie. Like, for example, what are the bad guys called? Brother
Riker.
but he's brother whatever, the main guy. Yeah, I'll have to look it up.
So there's Rufus Riker.
Yeah, Brother Rufus. That's what they always call him, is Brother Rufus, because they're all brothers. Mm-hmm. So Brother Rufus he's not just this like terribly bad guy. You know, he's an immigrant who has made his way here. He respects when Shane defeats his friends and tries to offer him a job. He even respects when Starrett defeats his friends and tries to offer him, or when he's the leader and tries to offer him a job. You know, and some of that is to take away the opposition, but some of that is respect, and like, but he's not just cut and dry like that's the bad guy.
Right. Well, actually, and like that was one thing that I thought, another scene that I thought was really well done and interesting was there's a whole scene where he basically lays out his case for why he feels that he is actually in the right here, and it's hard to completely find fault in his argument. You know, this whole idea of the conflict between the Rangers versus the ranchers, you know, he's thinking this used to be really dangerous land before me and my kind came and cleared out all the savages, made it safe. And their business is ranging their cattle all up and down the prairie. But then you get, you know, guys like Joe Starrett coming in, and he wants to just settle. And so he builds a bunch of fences and he reroutes a creek. And all of a sudden, the range that, Rufus has been using all this time, he can't do it that way anymore. And now he can't water his cattle where he used to. And he's feeling like, well, wait, what? How I was here first. And yet it's a fair argument to go the other way too. Of like, well, yeah, but it wasn't your land any more than it before. I'm the one that's following the legal rules. But Of course, the legal rules are set by people back in Washington who could care less about what's happening 500 miles away in land that nobody cares about, right? You know, it's more like, oh, sure, well, we don't want you on the streets of Philadelphia. So, you guys just set up land wherever you want out there and, just claim it and it's yours. You know what I mean? It's like...
That's what I'm saying. That's some of the beauty of the movie, is that the bad guy, there's ambiguity with that bad guy.
Yeah.
There's ambiguity with a guy who we think is just purely bad, which is Chris, whatever his name is, I guess Riker. He works for the Rikers.
Well, so there's Jack Wilson, who is played by Jack Palance.
We'll get to him.
Yeah. But then Chris Calloway is the guy that...
right. He's the one that initially starts the fight.
Yeah,
just
the fight.
He bullies Shane. Then Shane comes back, starts the fight with him, and like gets in this whole thing. Well, he eventually gets tired of the Rikers' like insistence. Like once they burned the guy's farm and they're running people off, like all of a sudden it's not fun anymore. It was fun just to bully people around and sit in the bar and screw with guys, throw whiskey on them, but to get your ass kicked and then to go burn people's farms down, he didn't want a part of that. So he goes to Shane and lets him know what's going on, what the double cross is going to be. So he has some ambiguity to him. He's a real character, which he started as just the guy who picks fights with Shane. And then, yes, you have the hired gun in Jack Palance, which what a great character, because again, he seems like the most cut and dry, simple character of the whole movie, but he's not, because there's a whole like thing with him is, does he have this like Southern pride or the Yankee pride, or can't remember which one.
Well, there's Tory.
Well, Tory has
Tory
too, yeah.
Well, but Wilson is the one that calls Stonewall Jackson trash and Southern.
Right. That's right. He has the Yankee.
Yeah,
right. He has the Yankee pride. So it's there, but he mentions that a couple of times, and even says like when they call him out and they say, "Oh, you're just a Yankee sympathizer," blah blah blah, and he's like, "Prove it," and that's what starts the gunfights. Like, there's that ambiguity. He's not just this guy who came in to shoot people. Like he comes in and he hates these guys from Alabama. Like he has that Yankee pride. Like he feels like these guys are below him.
That's interesting because, again, that's not how I read it. I read it as he really is just a killer and he likes that. But part of that whole thing is he has to make them draw on him so he can outdraw them and kill them. That's part of the ritual of the thing. That's how he gets off, so to speak, is that so I don't know that I felt like he had, especially the Yankee pride specifically, as much as he's trying to pick a fight with Tori to make Tori draw on him so that he can outdraw him and kill him. And then later, what Shane calls him that is because he's repeating the insult that Tori called him.
Right. And that's where I felt like where it left him just picking a fight to realizing that Shane had realized that's a real thing with him. That's a way to get to him because he does see them as below him. He sees them as these Southern, trash, Stonewall Jackson trash, like these Alabama bumpkins, and he's much more elite than them and he's the better gunfighter and he's more proper. Like he carries himself that way. He talks that way. And then when Shane redirects that insult and it affects him in a way that causes him to get like more upset, that's what made me feel like there's more to it than that. Like, and that's the thing. But also, I was also looking at this movie with all of these ambiguities. Like, there's so much to it where every single character seems to have, like even the kid, like he hates that Shane, is this outsider who's sort of infiltrated his family, but he respects him because he's like he's the gunfighter,
Did he ever hate him for infiltrating his family though? I didn't ever get any of that. He did
say, "I hate you, Shane," at one point.
Well, he said, "I hate you specifically for hitting my dad in the head with a gun when you were fighting with him."
Right, and I felt like the reason why that was so elevated was because the kid understood that there was the tension between him and his dad and his mom, and they're all. And again, maybe I'm reading too much into it. I was looking at every character with what are their different motivations, because there are some that is very very distinct, like Riker, like Starrett, like Shane. But then some of the other sub characters, it's like, well, you can see that, So
yeah,
so
I mean,
it was a stretch, but I don't feel like Jack Palance's is. I felt like that was supposed to be part of his character, was that he had this pride of being a Yankee and being above them.
Well, I definitely think that he thought he was above everybody else, but I didn't think that it was necessarily tied to the Yankee aspect as much as he just thought he was better generally. And that because the way I saw that character is he is essentially the dark version of Shane, right? He is what Shane would be if Shane didn't have this actual heroic moral compass that he's got. He didn't want to become what Wilson is, and that's why he's trying to get away from it. And so Wilson represents the dark side of this gunfighter element. And I don't want to make it like it's too simple there, because I do think that his character is that basically the way, kind of like what I was saying with Shane earlier, is that you get the feeling that there's sort of this ritual that like every town he goes through, he finds some way to insert himself into whatever conflict is happening there, pick fights with people, and then end up killing them because he's actually a much better fighter than they are. But he makes them pick the fight. He makes them throw the first blow or whatever. Well, although sometimes not even that.
Because it makes them draw first.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that it's part of the idea, his ego as a gunfighter is,
yes,
it's the gunfighter's code. He doesn't care about the morality of whether it's right to commit murder or whatever, but it's like the rules of, you're only a cool gunfighter if that's how you do it. Otherwise, you're just a guy who shoots people, randomly, or a murderer.
They floated a couple of times about the law and whether, the law would see it this way, and oh well, so and so drew on him first, so the law isn't gonna like go after him. You know, they kind of flirt with it a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that there's an element of that to it too. But just like that whole sequence, it's very parallel, I think, to the way Shane picked the fight with the guys in the saloon earlier, and Wilson with Tori, of this idea that I'm going to make you start this, except that that's all kind of a show, because we know that it's really him starting it. He is just deliberately trying to provoke the other guy into, drawing first, so that he can say, well, what can I do? He was going to kill me. I had to shoot him. But we saw that he provoked the situation. And so that's how I read Wilson's character, is that his ego was all about the aspect of being a cool gunfighter, and that being his identity, as opposed to the Yankee element. But it's definitely true that he saw himself as above everybody else there, even Riker, who he was ostensibly working for. Because there's definitely this element of like, oh, sure, you're going to pay me to come in and kill somebody? Fine, that's what I do, whatever. Because even the bit where like Riker's talking about like, might just have to kill him. And then Wilson's just like, you mean you might have to have me kill him?
I might just have to kill him, yeah, or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, and whatever the line was. But yeah, so just that element of, I'll not have you refer to me like I'm a hammer or something. I'm coming in here and saving your butt. It's not that you are using me like a tool. But I think it was about his ego as a gunfighter is how I read it. But at the same time, the fact that there are so many of these elements that we read differently is just speaks to the level of ambiguity and complexity that they did put into the movie.
Right. That's what ultimately that point is that I could argue with you, but that's just like we could sit here and argue over whether he's dead at the end. But the reality is the movie doesn't give us enough to definitively say. Like, does the movie give us enough to definitively say that, Wilson is only a hired gun and doesn't have Yankee pride and think that that's part of why he's better than everybody else? No, we're interpreting that.
We don't really know enough, because we know things that he has said and ways that he's acted, but we don't know in his head, Right. Is he saying that stuff just to pick a fight with Tori? Does he mean it?
Yeah, does he just want somebody to draw first because that's how he gets off? Or does he want them to say it because that aggravates him to the point that it gets him ready for a gunfight? Like, those are so subtle that the movie doesn't give us that. And that's... I respect how the movie does that, and that's why I think it's interesting that the way the movie ends and the whole reason I said it's on this list is because the discussion at the end is Shane dead? And or does he die? I guess it's not whether is he physically dead at that point, does he die? My
ultimate takeaway, I think, although again, I think it's deliberately ambiguous, but I feel like there's a couple of things that feel like movie code for he's dead, except that the actual final shot, if you're watching his hands, you can see he's still kind of guiding the horse around stuff as it goes over the cemetery. But at the same time, the fact that we see the last shot is riding over the cemetery and he's got his head slumped and he's not responding and we know he was wounded, that feels like the movie telling us maybe he is dead, but just there's an element of he's still guiding the horse in the actual shot, which might just be an element of they needed the horse to go where they wanted it to go in the last shot.
Right. And so here's where my opinion is somewhat differentiates, is that you're right on all of that. Like movie stuff, like imagery, yes. Hand slumped, hand over the graveyard. They brought the graveyard in a couple of times. However, supposedly in the book, It doesn't explicitly say that he lives, but it speaks more to that.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, he was guiding the horse. So where I come down on this is based on everything else I saw in this movie, I believe that they purposely aren't trying to tell you one way or the other. They're trying to give enough evidence that he is dead and enough evidence that he is alive and let you go with it as you please.
Deliberately ambiguous. And I agree. Because if they wanted it to be clear he was dead, they certainly could have done that better. But the way that it's not clear does seem deliberate. And maybe all of those things I was mentioning were really just an element of, otherwise people might not even pick up that there was anything happening at all. They might just assume, oh, he's just writing off, just like he just said that he was going to. You know what I mean? And so all of those things may just be what has to be in there for us to even ask the question.
Right. And this reminds me of something I bring up all the time, but for whatever reason, I've never looked up. Supposedly, anecdotally, there is an interview with Hemingway about The Old Man and the Sea, where they ask him about this symbolism, and is there Christ symbolism with the 40 days and all that stuff. And he specifically says the book is about a man and a fish. And what he means in that interview is, I wrote those words. What the reader takes from them is their business. I wasn't trying to tell you had to look at it one way. And again, this is all anecdotal. I've heard, I learned this in college and I never looked it up, but whatever. Supposedly Hemingway did that. Sounds like a thing Hemingway.
Well, it's like one of the Hitchcock quotes that we've discussed a number of times, because this stuff kind of keeps coming up. But the idea of why are there so many staircases in your movies, Mr. Hitchcock? Is like, well, my characters live on buildings with more than one floor, and it expedites their progress from floor to floor. Didn't say it right, but the idea of just
where Hemingway was saying, the book's about a guy and a fish. They say no symbolism to it. No, just about a guy and a fish. When Hemingway, being more clever than that, means that the words don't necessarily mean it's up to the reader to interpret what they say. And so I look at this movie the same way. It's up to whoever views it. You can take it however you want. You want to leave it with Shane was this, anti-hero who went in there and saved this town and died on the way out, and this was his last big hurrah, and that's why he didn't want to be a gunfighter anymore, and he left like that, and now Joe and his wife and his kid can all live happily ever after, then awesome. Like, take the movie that way. You want to look at it as that Shane wasn't really that great of a dude, picked fights with people everywhere that he went, managed to get himself kind of screwed up, will probably figure it out by the next town and start all over again. Watch it that way, Well,
and I think that, the truth is somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean? It's kind of like you could have Shane be the kind of guy who sort of pathologically reenacts this sort of ritual, but that doesn't mean he's not really helping people.
Right. And I guess that's where I lie, is that the movie is not meant to be on either extreme or somewhere in between. The movie is left to give you a canvas to decide where you feel. Mm-hmm. And it works with the cinematography of the movie and all that kind of stuff. So I left feeling much better about this movie than I feel like you did. Not that you disliked it, but I respect it. I respect the movie quite a bit. That worked for me. Mm-hmm. That sort of, we're going to lay out all of these events. We're going to let you figure out how you feel about them. That's how the movie felt to me. And
and the thing is, I'm certainly not going to tell anybody that it's not worth liking. I respect the movie a lot. And again, I feel like I've spoken a bit on why that might be. But again, I was a little bit surprised to feel the way that I did, just because I feel like I like Westerns. There's lots of older movies that I like. So it's not purely just a, 1950s style movie pacing element. You know, and I feel like I can look at it in context and see all the things that it does well, but for just a personal entertainment factor, it just wasn't working for me. So I think it's more a matter of taste rather than quality.
Yeah, well, and I feel like your taste is part of what I like about the quality of the movie is that the movie laid out these elements and they didn't work for you.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't entertain you. And that's okay because the movie's not trying to convince you to be entertained. The movie laid out elements. You leave with what you want to leave with. And maybe I'm giving it more credit than it deserves, but that's
I don't know. It's,
you know,
it's a weird feeling that I'm left with this movie, just because there are movies that I watch where I don't like it and I blame the movie. And then there are other movies where I almost feel like I'm blaming myself. And that's a little bit more like I feel here, where it's like, I feel like the movie was fine and it was me for some reason. I don't know.
And I feel like that reinforces my point. Like the movie was fine. The movie laid out all the elements exactly the way that it should have. But your interpretation and your feeling of them was not a way that you felt like was awesome. So you don't like it. So it's on you. It is on you. You know, I think we've come to this common ground.
All right. Okay, well, so ready to rearrange the list?
Yeah. I wasn't going to be, but I mean, I thought I was, but now since we talked about it, I feel like I actually have moved Shane up in my mind by having to defend it to you.
Sure.
Which is okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, you go ahead.
Okay. I think I'm going to put It Happened One Night. I'm going to put it, I think, between Network and Taxi Driver. So
yeah, so still solid position, yeah.
Yeah. And of course it's a very different movie than either of those. It's doing very different things. But just in terms of arbitrary numerical placement, that's where I'm putting it. Shane, I think I'm gonna put it lower, just because, as much as I respect it, you know, I'm just looking at other movies that I might put it higher than, just on the basis of saying the intellectual admiration or whatever. But then I just look at those other movies and I'm going to say, do I really want to say that I think it's better than that one? And I don't. So I'm going to put it, let's see, between A Streetcar Named Desire and Swing Time.
Where's that? Oh, that's way down there.
Yeah. All right, so that leaves, trying to scroll. So that puts It Happened One Night now at 55 and Shane at 94.
You still got His Girl Friday above it.
Well, I like it better.
I know you do. I'm going to put It Happened One Night. I was going to put it, I know it's exactly where I put the last movies I went, but below North by Northwest.
Okay.
Like, I kind of feel like it's about that same, or no, sorry, that wasn't the last one. We did Rear Window last time. Sorry.
Yep, Rear Window and A Streetcar Named Desire were the last two.
Sorry, I thought this was, but that's where it should go. Yeah.
Okay.
And Shane, I mean, it's going to go farther down. I'm going to admit that, but I'm going to put it. It's got to go below The Wild Bunch for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to go below Deer Hunter. Actually, let's put it below Saving Private Ryan. I think that's about right there. Yeah.
Okay. Resorting these. All right, so that leaves It Happened One Night at 63 and Shane at 79.
And do we have the Lord of the Rings colored weird for some reason?
No, I think it's just long, so it made like an extra line on there.
No, it looks like on mine it's colored a different color, but
oh well. Here, I'll make them all the same color now. They should all be the same color now.
Yep. All right, that's fine. Okay.
All right. So the next two movies will be number 44, The Philadelphia Story, 1944 screwball comedy. Again, with this one has Cary Grant. I'm forgetting who else at the moment. I think Jimmy Stewart's also in this one, and I don't remember who the female lead is. And then Midnight Cowboy at number 43, 1969 drama. Unless I'm misremembering, it's the one that has, hey, we're walking here.
Yeah, that's it.
So I've seen Philadelphia Story. Wait, no, hang on. No, I have not seen Philadelphia Story. I'm looking at the column on the spreadsheet rather than just remembering whether or not I've seen it. So you've seen Philadelphia Story. I have not. And then we've both seen previously Midnight Cowboy, but we'll rewatch and see what we think about it now.
Yeah. Mm.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening and or watching. We hope you enjoyed. And this video will go up on the YouTube channel, and the audio podcast will follow soon after. But for now, watch good movies, everybody.
Yep.